All right, so it's continuing on time. So we're on to our second talk of the day. Now up we've got John. John is a game developer. He's going to be talking not specifically about making games, but about making communities around games. So please take it away, John.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Tim wonderfully introduced, I'm John Manning. My Twitter username is Displester. Please follow me there. And I'm going to be talking about how we built a community of game developers around a game development tool that's released as open source. So the credentials slide, I'm an author for O'Reilly. I've written a whole bunch of books. Most recently, Please Buy Practical Artificial Intelligence with Swift. This talk is not about that, but it's worth looking at anyway. I'm best known for my work on a game called Night in the Woods, which came out in 2017. Thank you. And people liked it. And one of the things that I did for Night in the Woods was I produced a thing called Yarn Spinner. Yarn Spinner is the system that powers all of the dialogue in the game. So Night in the Woods is a very dialogue-heavy game. Most of what you do involves talking to other characters, and so a really good, robust, solid solution for managing game dialogue for that game was required. So Yarn Spinner is a combination of like a node-based dialogue tool combined with a scripting language that we invented. So you can manage all of the dialogue in the way that you flow through the conversations with characters in the game, and then zoom in on the individual nodes and write it in like a screenplay style format. The system was written for the use of a single writer. In fact, the lead writer of Night in the Woods, lead dialogue writer Scott Benson, who was also the game's lead artist, didn't have time to also learn how to be a programmer as well and be a gameplay implementer. And so most of what he did was he would go to literally a cafe and write on paper all the game's dialogue, then come home, transcribe it into Yarn, the language that Yarn Spinner interprets and executes, and then do whatever logic was needed to actually make that work in the context of the game. And it worked really, really well. So Yarn Spinner, in addition to powering all the game's dialogue, also powers all the game's cutscenes. We released it as open source in around 2015, I think, like 2 years before the release of Night in the Woods itself. It's grown and grown and grown in terms of community interest. So a couple of really cool games that have come out recently that use Yarn Spinner include Frog Detective 2, The Case of the Invisible Wizard, which is a beautiful little fun game, and also A Short Hike, which is, I believe, up for some awards at the Independent Games Festival this year at the Game Developers Conference. So Night in the Woods makes use of Yarn Spinner like this. It's running lines of dialogue, and then the player has the ability to choose between options based on what they select. Yarn Spinner will then jump you to different lines of dialogue, and the whole thing works pretty seamlessly to the player. So this is the script powering the scene that you just saw, and you'll notice that there are some lines that you didn't see. Because the player in that video chose the line, I don't know, it ran the line where Greg says, I'll help you pick somewhere out. But if they'd chosen not long, gonna move to, then another set of lines was run. And at the end of that, in addition to running lines of dialogue, it also manages the game's state. So at the bottom of the slide, you'll see a number of instructions telling the game to modify variables, to perform actions in the scene, to unlock some art in other parts of the game, and also to change scene to another part of the game as well. So today I'm going to be talking about how we built the community surrounding Yarn Spinner, with a particular focus on how we communicate the open source nature of the project to a community of game developers who are not themselves open source developers. They're often smaller independent studios, solo developers, or larger studios as well. I'll be talking about what you should know when you're building a tool that's being used by people who are not as familiar with open source methodologies and practices in the open source tradition as people in this room might be. As well as that, we'll be talking about how to build a community in general for when you use developers. So let's take a look at how game development and open source kind of interact. So game developers have a very, very long tradition of sharing code, sharing just anything with each other, because a lot of people, especially younger developers these days, learned how to develop at all, how to program at all through an interest in making games. And so they hop onto YouTube, they hop onto forums, they hop onto Discord usually these days to find and share tips and code and art and everything they need to start making their own video games, usually with either a professional interest, they want to get into the games industry, or for a hobby interest, they want to be able to make some art in the form of a game. Now, this sharing is not based in the tradition of open source. When we think of open source sharing, we think of some fairly structured ways of sharing. We think in terms of the licenses. We think in terms of, we have GitHub and we have Bitbucket and we have these common places to go to share code and the ways in which we share code and ways in which we discuss that code. Game developers love to share as much as we do. And I don't mean to create a gulf between open source and game dev. There's a massive overlap, but more often than not, I see a lot of game developers who simply release code out into the wild, go, here it is, have some code, and they don't attach a license because they aren't aware of the need for a license. I've often seen more than a few times people declining to add a license because they believe that it will actually restrict what you can do in the code. I'm not going to add a license, that'll just limit what you can do. No, because when you attach a license, you're actually giving more freedom, because by default everything is proprietary and locked down. We often see people released with no license or bad licenses. So, for example, a popular one in the game dev circles is the WTFPL, the do what the fork you want with license, which contains a single clause, which is you can do what the fork you like, which is legally ambiguous, to say the least. And also we have code being released under, not flippant licenses, but custom licenses, which can cause some problems when you want to integrate that code in other open source projects. For example, 2 days ago, an amazing game by Terry Kavanagh called V was released. The game was released many years ago. The source code was released 2 days ago. And V is a wonderful game. Strongly recommend that you check it out. It's a beautiful, punishing platformer. Lots of love for V. The source code was released, and they said it's open source. But the license for V's source code actually contains clauses prohibiting commercial use and requiring you to contact the developer if you want, and a number of clauses that it appears to be based on MIT, but with additional clauses on top, and that caused some rumblings from the open source community who said this isn't open source, and the conversation diverged into away from, wow, that's amazing, thank you for sharing, into, you didn't do it the right way. And that kind of created a little bit of friction between some communities. But look at the code. It's really, really good to see such a popular and wonderful game being having source code made available. The other alternative way in which people get their software in the game dev scene is very similar to how other software scenes work, and that is seat-based subscription model licensing of proprietary code. So hopefully that's not a astonishing thing to people. People generally want to make money out of selling their code, and a popular way to do that is to sell licenses. Photoshop, Unity, Houdini, most professional asset and content generation tools distributed in this way. What that means is that larger studios tend to be quite familiar with dealing with sales teams, but possibly less familiar with people with rando indie devs like me. It also means that there's a vocabulary of how we talk about software licensing. So it's not sufficient to say MIT license to people who are brand new to open source. It's important to explain in some fairly clear and simple terms what people can and can't do. This is very similar to how Creative Commons deals with their licenses. They have the actual license itself and then a human readable license that summarizes it. So that's the open sourcey part of it, but in addition to that, we also want to build a community around this code as well, and that requires marketing. So, like any other product, open source projects have to be marketed if you want anyone to be using them at all. Now, that marketing does not necessarily mean a significant ad spend, it just means you need to be aware of how you talk about your project to others. This involves figuring out what kind of audience is likely to be using your project, and then figure out what they want and how to talk about your project to them in a way that aligns with what they want. So we did a bit of thinking about how Yarn Spinner is being used. A lot of people discovered Yarn Spinner through its association with Night in the Woods. And so the audience kind of has a bit of overlap. So people who are using Yarn Spinner tend to be independent game developers who are probably hobbyists, possibly professionals. We are aware of some studios using Yarn Spinner, and we love them for it, but usually it's indies, solos, that kind of stuff. Usually young adults, I'm guessing around 25. probably English speaking, again, because of the audience that goes Night in the Woods. It's released primarily in English. Almost certainly on Twitter. Most game devs are on Twitter. It's very rare to see a social network that has the same kind of population of game devs. And they probably learned how to code from YouTube. Right? So that means not, that they are towards the younger end of people. So that meant that we had to figure out like our branding. We hired a really cool designer to make our awesome logo, and also our color palette, and also our font selection. So big shout out to Cecil Richard, who made our amazing logo. Hire them, they're great. Once you have something that you can attach the project to visually and you use it everywhere and use it consistently. Figure out how that brand is going to be deployed and be consistent with it, such as this slide deck. We also figured out how we're going to deploy Yarn Spinner in terms of online presence. So there are 5 main pillars of Yarn Spinner's presence online. So GitHub, Twitter, Slack, the web, and also our live streams. So the most important of these is in fact the Twitter presence, because that's where people tend to be. It's where people spend their time. There's a really active game dev scene on Twitter, and that means there's lots of opportunity for discovery of Yarn Spinner on that platform. And also because all the developers have an existing presence on Twitter, we're able to leverage that both to help build the audience, and also the familiarity with how that platform works means that we're able to speak the language and be aware of not just, like, for example, the memes, but also just the phrasing and the tonality that people expect from Twitter. Now, we live in an age where Sunny D, the orange juice brand, pretends to have depression. The reason why people do this is because people want relatable, engaging personas from brands. This is an extreme case, and no one actually really liked that, what Sunny D and Moon Pie were doing here, where Sunny D basically acted like someone who was going through a depressive episode, and people began to push back on, like, you're a brand, you're not an individual here. And so the account brand saying Bay gave a fairly succinct analysis. People crave authenticity, and that's what they look for in their relationships and with their brands, which is why the orange juice account has depression now. Good. So Twitter-based marketing does rely on some degree of personality. What you just saw was a fairly extreme case, and I recommend that you don't take it to that level. But at the same time, relatability is an important element of that. You don't need to be a brand saying Bay, but creating some kind of persona for your Twitter presence does help you figure out how you can approach people. So these points here, by the way, are big thanks to Harris Foster, who's the community designer for Finji, who is a studio that published Night in the Woods. People tend to engage with an online presence in the same way as that online presence acts and behaves. This is the reason why when a comedian posts a joke on Twitter, most of the people replying are people trying to make a joke back at them. So the persona that you put out into the world from your social media presence does tend to attract similar kinds of attitudes, which means that you need to consider how you want to tweet, not just what you want to tweet. I saw someone taking a photo here, so if you want to grab that, I'll leave it on there. Cool. You're welcome. So with that in mind, we designed how Yarn Spinner's Twitter persona should be. Now, I'm not being extremely cynical with this, because this is mostly me realizing how I present myself online, deciding what elements that I liked, and then tying that into what I expect people who are going to be using Yarn Spinner expect as well. So Yarn Spinner's persona is enthusiastic, it's eager to share, it's a little bit self-deprecating, and also it's got a bit of the millennial performative instant irony poisoning that afflicts everyone these days because it's 2020. And also, importantly, refers to itself in the first person. I don't want this to be, hey, Yarn Spinner, we're here to help. It's Yarn Spinner, hey, I want to help you out. And I make it pretty clear that it's a person behind this rather than, I'm not trying to be Moon Pie saying I'm depressed. Sorry, excuse me, Sunny D saying I'm depressed. But rather, it's, hi, I'm Yarn Spinner an identity, but hi, I'm going to help you use Yarn Spinner. With that in mind, the actual stuff that we put out there via our social media presence is largely feature related or what people are making. So we tweet about new features, we tweet about features that aren't new because people are going to be joining the conversation, as it were, late in the game. We do retweet people who talk about Yarn Spinner, but not too much, because we don't want to be marketing to people who are already following us and saying, hey, have you heard of Yarn Spinner? They have. We don't need to tell them that. What we do want to show them is, look at this cool thing that someone made. and boosting that small amount. We don't have a huge amount of reach, but people do enjoy being part of that whole experience of not just Yarn Spinner as a project, but Yarn Spinner as an overall thing. So we boost our fans. To that end, like anytime, well not anytime, but when people say, hey, I made this with Yarn Spinner and it's great, I retweet them, I boost them, and it helps people discover stuff. It's great. So images do grab more attention than text in a wide variety of places, not just Twitter. The problem is that Yarn Spinner is largely text. So our solution has actually been to post pictures of text and also screenshots of games that use Yarn Spinner. So to that end, we have been doing some stuff like writing a really pretty syntax highlighter, which allows us to demonstrate language features and just really promote what is going on inside Yarn Spinner, what you can do with Yarn Spinner. The web component of our presence online is the most serious business part of the project. So we make sure we aren't flippant or silly or too casual there. If they're on the site, that means that they're there to learn. And so we try and be as comprehensive and straightforward. Like, this is Yarn Spinner, it does this thing, go here to download it. Not, hey kids, welcome to wacky Yarn Spinner fun time. That's not what the web is about. We have a Slack community, and that primarily exists to be the direct point of contact that people can have with the developers. So some kind of live chat system is really important to have for a community. We use Slack, but Discord is increasingly a popular option, especially for game developers, because game developers tend to be game players, and Discord is where the players are. So we use the Slack for community Q&A, tech support, announcement, and we primarily use that for giving us direct access to users in reverse as well. Any kind of chat-based space requires attention and moderation. It is work to run this kind of stuff. So it's important to promote friends and other trusted people to some kind of position of authority. It's also really important to be aware of the corrosive nature of people, toxic elements in the community. You should not be afraid to ban people because they are silent. The GitHub is largely the central development hub. People go to the GitHub page for downloads, to file bugs, and also to learn how to contribute. They're not really there to see the cool stuff that people are making with Yarn Spinner. This is more like the guts of the project itself. And so to that end, the README has been designed to be largely about features and how to contribute. This is not hugely game dev specific. There's not really much difference between Yarn Spinner's README and popular open source READMEs, but we want to make sure that we aren't there to pay on GitHub README. For streaming is really important for any kind of game dev related thing, because games are largely marketed through streams. So our streams tend to be fairly high energy opportunities for live Q&A and for demos. Most people working in games these days like to learn via video, at least partially, which means that using streams is an excellent way to grow the audience. It also allows us to record the stream, and that gives us material to post to YouTube as well, which allows us to build just an archive of that good content. It's really important to be fairly consistent with how often you are putting out material. Consistent delivery of your marketing is really important, and it's really important to never ever go quiet. A lot of people feel like they don't have anything important to say. That's fine, even if it's not brand new. You can put something out there. Find a tip that you know about, and you as a developer, you're quite like it's integrated into your brain, and just push it out there. That tweet from earlier of, hey, yarn tip, here's a language syntax feature. Like, that's something that's fairly well known to most developers, but anytime you put out a tip, you're teaching someone something new. If you have a monetization element to your project, never shy away from promoting that. It's important, and it's important to realize what value that your project gives people, and people will not know that they can support you unless you tell them. So to that end, please back our Patreon. It's at patreon.com/secretlab. So running the project is not terribly dissimilar from standard open source procedures. We respond quite quickly, at least we aim to respond quite quickly to people who post issues and to people who give pull requests. We welcome new contributors quite quickly and ask them to, and thank them for reporting bugs, and that helps them feel like a part of the project. We also give people admin access and give people responsibility. It can be quite tempting to try and hold on to the project because it's your baby, and there's a lot of your personal personality in that. Try and avoid that kind of feeling. Don't be precious about it. We gave, for example, complete control over the web editor to a person who'd made like 5 pull requests, and he's done an amazing job. Also, it's important to accept imperfect pull requests. Don't be waiting for the perfect feature to come in. Accept it, and then you can make changes yourself. It's also really useful to flag certain bugs as low-hanging fruit. Don't be tempted to fix the easy bugs. Your job as the lead developer is someone who knows a lot about the project and is in a position to solve the really hard ones. So if something easy comes in, flag it as low-hanging fruit and say, hey, this is a good first point of contact for people who want to contribute. So yeah, we found that to be really good for like bringing more people in. You will get people who have tech questions. Try and be as available as possible because your users are going to have the best ideas for both feature requests, but also help you realize bugs and features that you should have. So running this kind of thing is quite hard work, but it is incredibly rewarding, both in terms of the emotional side of it. You love to see people working on your stuff. In terms of the technical side, Yarn Spinner is nowhere near as good without the support of the people who contribute code, and also financially, if that's important to you, it is for me, because it helps raise the people who could potentially support you financially. So with that in mind, go and make an awesome community, and I want to see what you make. Thanks.
So we've got a little bit of time for some questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
In regards to always being available to your users, I find that 99% of the requests I get are when I'm asleep because I live in Australia and no one else does.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Bring on people who are not in your time zone. So going back to that point of giving people responsibility, you will find it easier to have people who are as knowledgeable as you if they have been working alongside you on there. So if you're not at a point where that's possible yet in your project, just make that information, the fact that you're not going to be available all the time, quite easy to find. So when people come in and ask you questions, just say, hey, FYI, I'm in Australia, or I'm in this time zone, and so it'll take me some time. Just this morning, we put out a post saying, hey, everyone, we're going to be less available for a week because we're LCA. So just communicating your availability is really important, and you don't have to be on call, but being as available as you can, and that last part is important, as you can is important. Cool. Any other questions? One?
How much of your week do you dedicate to Yarn Spinner?
How much of my...
Your week.
Of my week? More and more every day. So last week, basically the entire week was nothing but Yarn Spinner because we launched 1.0. These days, it's about 2 full-time days a week, and we want to increase that. That's made possible if we get more backers, because that way we can put more of our time and we have to work less on client stuff. So yeah. Right now it's about 2 days a week.
No? Well, please join me in thanking John again.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Anna. I'm a software engineer, and I work in realestate.com.au. Today, I will tell you a very short story about developers and ops relationships. Well, big warning sign here. Everything that I'm going to say is based on my personal experience, and some names and details I changed for the purpose of this talk. So I started working in IT more than 13 years ago. And I'm around 7 years with my current company. And back then, we didn't have DevOps. We had developers, we had ops people, and there was a super massive black hole in the middle. We were not friends those days. I think we were more like 2 different species. And there were many things that were setting us apart. One of them is that developers didn't have access to production for the systems that they were building. So our continuous delivery process looked like this. Developers would write some code, throw it to QA. QA would test it on an environment that was nothing like production. Then we would package it up and throw those packages down on our ops team to deploy and support. Well, that was our process. And we call it Agile. Our ops team, they were not very strong Agile believers. They didn't really like this package down approach. But they were not complaining. They were ops people. They were tough. And you needed to be tough to be an ops person back then. You needed to smoke a lot, drink a lot, use tough language, maybe skip a few showers. Be tough. And as a developer, I had a very difficult relationship with that team. I guess because we had different priorities. My priority was to build more stuff. It was literally in my KPIs. My manager would even try to calculate how many lines of code I was writing per day. But I always confuse her with my refactoring.
I'm out.
2 lines in, 10 lines out. At the end, it was very hard for her to calculate. So my performance was tied to the number of builds. And I was trying to build as much stuff as fast as I possibly could. But our ops team, I think they just wanted to get a good night's sleep. There were conflicted priorities, but we were agile, so we tried to collaborate. I will tell you how our regular interactions would look like. On any given day, when I have a build ready, I would go downstairs to the dungeon. We used to keep our ops people in a dungeon. They don't really like sunlight. I would find a random ops person. Let's name him Steve. And I would say something like, "Hey, Steve, why you haven't deployed the build that I sent you 10 minutes ago?" He would say, "Well, hello, nice to see you too. I have no idea what are you talking about." And I would say, "Well, open your email and you will see that there is a piece of software attached to it. I want you to deploy it." Well, back in those days, we didn't have the fancy CI tools like Buildkite or Bamboo, so we were emailing each other packages. So he would open his email and said, "Well, I clearly see there is a piece of something, but what changes are you trying to deploy? So I need to know what I'm deploying. Like, what's inside your package?" What's inside? You should never ask developer this question. What's inside the package? It's like asking a butcher what's inside the sausage. It's code, it's working, all it matters. Like ops people can understand the complexity of software, please. But he would deploy it. And the next day, I would find out that he rolled back my build. So I needed to go to the dungeon again.
Made quick work of that.
And I would not be so friendly. I would basically scream at him, like, "Why you roll back my build?" And he would say, "Well, at 1 a.m., I received a call from a very angry Italian. And he was complaining that application is not working. So after I checked all the possible network issues, I rolled back the latest build, and it came back to normal. So I think that your code has a problem." Well, my company used to have an office back in Italy. And unlike Australians, they were using very fast and modern browser at that time called Internet Explorer. And okay, I put a comma in the wrong place, and my script was not working in Internet Explorer because we never bothered to test our changes in that browser. So technically, it was QA's fault.
3 South
But
Side.
we were agile, so we taught our ops team to test every single build after they deployed in Internet Explorer. You know, you made a mistake, you learn from it. So years went by, and culture started to change a little bit in my company. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago when we pioneered a new platform called Team Managed Infrastructure. What it meant that from then on, every single development team is also responsible for deploying and supporting the applications. Our ops team got so excited about it, they even came out of the dungeon. They came to our team area and said, "Congratulations. Now, guys, you are the lucky owners of all the systems that you guys work on. Here is your production access, and here is the phone to talk to Italians. Ciao." Well, I wasn't excited about that change. I guess I was happy to have a production access for a change, but I didn't want to talk to angry Italians in the middle of the night. Back then, I was working with legacy financial systems that were running on Windows. Like, it was a nightmare to support them. One of our services had such a massive memory leak that our recommendation to support it was to restart it every 12 hours. Well, you know, it was an easy call for developers to make. It wasn't our job to do. Plus, as a developer, I was never accountable for the stuff that I built. I mean, if it turned out to be good, I would take credit for it. But if there was a problem, there were always ops people to fix it, and QAs to blame for it. But I could not stop the progress. The whole company was changing, so I had to join the after-hours pager. So what that package included? First, you need to carry your laptop 24/7 for 1 week. Second, no trips outside of good internet coverage zone. Third, 0 alcohol because you're dealing with financial systems. And lots of sleepless nights. Alcohol and smoking was my only therapy back in those days. They were helping me to deal with our financial systems and our agile process. I was not ready to give it up, even for 1 week. Though I realized that, you know, like, my laptop doesn't have a breathalyzer. But, you know, I was a good citizen. I needed to comply. So fine, I joined the pager. Well, I was voluntold. In my company, it meant you're highly encouraged to volunteer. And I started my shift on Monday. I got 0 alerts. Then came Tuesday. I got 0 alerts as well. I started to think, wow, that might be the easiest money that I will ever earn in my life. But then it came Wednesday. Turned out, Wednesday was the last day of the month. If you're dealing with financial systems, especially the ones that we have in my company, it meant that we need to bill and invoice our customers. And I completely forgot about it. So on Wednesday night, I received a call from a friendly ops person, Steve. He said something like, "Hey, I hope you're enjoying your pager. By the way, it's the last day of the month, so make sure that the billing run runs successfully." Oh, crap. I forgot about it. At that moment, I realized that I made a big mistake. I now need to babysit this stupid billing run. And it was stupid, because its monitoring system, well, it was a bit unconventional. When I say unconventional, I mean it's not gonna alert you when something went wrong, duh. It's gonna send you an email when it successfully completed a certain stage of the process. So even when nothing went wrong, you need to stay awake for 7 or 8 hours in the night to make sure that the process actually finished. Like, who would build such a stupid monitoring and alerting system? Well, technically, that was me. But, you know, I never had access to production. I mean, like, how should I know how the good monitoring and alerting look like? So there I was, at 10 p.m., in front of my computer, waiting for billing run to write me. Well, I got a first email saying something like, I started, great. Then I made myself a cup of tea and started to think about all the bad decisions in my life that led me to that point. But I also started to feel some empathy for, like, you have this bad intuition that, I think something is wrong. Well, there was no easy way to validate it. There was no diagnostic endpoint, nothing. So I said, OK. I'll just jump on the box. So I connected to the Windows box. I opened a task manager. And I tried to find the process that would indicate that it's coming from this billing run and it's running. I found nothing. I'm like, OK, logs. Logs. There should be logs somewhere. But as a developer, I realized I never actually bothered to log anything. I mean, why should I? I never had access to those logs anyway. So there were none. OK. I thought, it's a Windows box, so there should be system logs somewhere. And I found one. And there was a very weird error, saying something like, invalid character in line 306. At that moment, I just panicked. I'm like, I have no idea what it means. I have no idea if the process is running or not. Like, I exhausted all my options. I don't know what to do next. So I called Steve. He was very happy to receive my call after midnight. But I think he knew, because it took him 3 seconds to diagnose the problem. He said, it sounds like a Rob Smith problem. Like, what? Rob Smith? What are you talking about? And he's like, there is a customer, Rob Smith. I think he happened to have a carriage return symbol in his name. So every month, when his financial transactions end up in our database, billing run fails because it doesn't know how to deal with the carriage return symbol. I was like, what? How often that happens if you know so much about it? You don't even know his name. He's like, every month, apart from August. He's probably on leave at that time. I was furious, like one customer breaking the whole billing run for a $5 billion company every single month? Like, why you never told us about it? He's like, I told you guys, I told you multiple times, you need to fix your validation, you need to make sure the data is correct. But you're very busy running around, doing other stuff. Well, it was too late to argue about that. So I asked him, fine, I mean, what should I do now? We need to invoice our customers tomorrow. He said, connect to the database, find every single transaction that Rob Smith made that month, and remove a carriage return symbol from his name. So there I was, writing SQL statements on our production database in the middle of the night, unsupervised. When I clicked execute button, I realized I should have probably back it up, just in case. Well, if my script by accident would corrupt or remove our financial data, I would be in a big trouble. My company would be in a big trouble. But I didn't know any better. It was my first time dealing with production issues. I was stressed, it was middle of the night. Well, luckily for me, my script worked. I restarted the process, but I still needed to stay awake till 7 a.m. the next morning to make sure this bloody process finished. So when I came back to work next day, I was very angry, I was tired, but I learned a few lessons. First, never ever signed up for a shift that falls on the last day of the month, if you're dealing with financial systems. Second, have some empathy for ops people. You know, their job is very hard. But honestly, since that night, my development practices changed a lot. I started to think about monitoring, logging, alerting, and documentation. Every system that I built after that, I started with SLAs. How it should work, how the system gonna tell me when it's not working, what should I log, what should I document, and whom I should escalate when something goes wrong. I think I was lucky that my whole team jumped on Pager with me, so it helped us to have a very productive conversations. And we gave a very good priority to support issues. I think the whole company changed. Well, we no longer keep our ops people in a dungeon. Now they enjoy the sunlight like the rest of us. I think they act more like consultants. They help us to set up infrastructure in the cloud, answer tricky questions, and keep an eye on our AWS bill. I cannot say that we lived happily ever after, but we go to the same pub and we drink the same beer. So for every developer in the audience, I encourage you to jump on Pager. Have this experience on another side of the fence, or at least pair with ops people when they dealing with production issues. For every ops person, have some empathy for developers. They're not making your life miserable on purpose. Try to understand their delivery pressures. Well, that is all that I prepared for today. I'm very keen on your feedback, so please deliver good one to me, constructive one to our organizer, Simon, and thank you very much for listening.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Linux Conf AU 2020 on the Gold Coast. First up, I'd like to introduce the Yukon Bear dancers for our Welcome to Country.
Good morning, everyone. We are the Yukon Bear General Dancers. We are traditional people from the Gold Coast area, which is the Yukon Bear language group. And the Yukon Bear language group goes from the Tweed River in the south to the Logan River in the north and out just over the mountains to the Bow Desert area. In our language for welcome, we say Jingari, the first song and dances to welcome you here to this country. Jingari wala wala Yukon Bear jagat. Anya malak, anya bayami. Jigiri wala wala ya kame jakan 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 yo Jingari, welcome. So we'd like to pay respects to our elders, past and present. We'd also like to pay respects to you guys and your families and your ancestors, no matter where you come from. The next dance is a dance about our people going fishing. And this is about going fishing on one particular fish, which is the mullet fish. The mullet is very important to our family here in the Gold Coast area. The mullet fish will migrate from the cold waters in the south to the warmer waters in the north. during the cooler months. And when we see the paperbark trees just starting to flower, that's the very first sign for our family that the mullet will start to travel through this area. And it's time to gather our fishing gear, our spears, our nets, head down to the water and start fishing. In our language for fish, we say jalam. Jalam mullet. Abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam. Alright. Hop. Abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam. Alright. Hop. Abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam, abra bla mama jalam. Warama. Alright. Hop. The next dance is a dance about the boomerang. In our language, we call the boomerangs baragan. The returning boomerang was used as a decoy or to trick the animals. Dance a boomerang, baragan. Entabra, habrabra, entabra, habrabra, entabra, habrabra, habrabra. Entabra, habrabra, entabra, habrabra, entabra, habrabra. Entabra, habrabra, entabra, habrabra, habrabra. So we're going to take a short break from the dancing while we have a didgeridoo solo. Didgeridoo is just a hollow piece of wood hollowed out by the termites or the white ants, and it's strictly a men's instrument, only to be played and touched by men only. The way we play didgeridoo, we vibrate our lips in a loose, relaxed fashion. We also have circular breathing, which allows us to play didgeridoo continuously for a long time without stopping. As didgeridoo player begins to play, just at the very start, I will ask him to raise his hand just to show you or indicate to you when he is taking that breath in through his nose. Didgeridoo. The next dance, our last dance, is a dance about the eagle. And the eagle is very important to our family. The eagle is our totem. It's like our brother. We call the eagle Mibin. na ya mibin. Hey, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na kaya na lam. Ay, and I'm up in my bin, na.
Sessions of the kernel miniconf. Up next, we have Thomas Sherbold-Toyer presenting on easy geo redundancy with Mars. Please welcome Thomas.
Thank you. I'm from 1&1, which is a European web hosting company, and I'm the only kernel developer there. I have a backup.
Just a quick talk to finish off the day. It's nothing that really requires any brain action on your part, so perhaps you'll be relieved after a long day of hearing about some useful things. I'm just going to have a quick talk to you about tooling. I'm someone who loves to spend time writing their editor instead of doing their job, and so I've collected a whole bunch of experiences with different tools and technologies. I think people, especially in the kernel community, tend to have adopted their workflow possibly decades ago and have kind of stuck to it, and there's been a whole world of fancy magic out there that can make our lives easier. So hopefully today you'll learn something new. Maybe not, maybe you'll just flame me, but at least you'll have fun doing it. So let's get on into it. So what kind of stuff am I going to be going over today? The first thing is text editors, kind of the bread and butter of actually working on the kernel. We have some old ones and some new ones. We have some magic inside those editors, which includes code completion, auto compilation when you change a file, Git magic and integrations. Compilers, the main reason I put this there is to emphasize the S, because there's actually more than one now, which can compile the kernel, which is pretty cool. Debuggers, there's actually been some crazy people writing new ones of these because all the old ones suck. This includes live kernel introspection and looking at crash dumps, and some random other bits and pieces that I've tacked on the end. So first, let's talk about text editors. When you talk about text editors, you have the big three categories. We have, of course, we have Vim, we have Emacs, and of course, Heresy. When I actually started out using Emacs because my proprietary editor didn't work on my ARM laptop, and I decided to use Evil Mode, which is Vim emulation in Emacs, and I thought that meant that both Vim and Emacs people would like me and adopt me as one of their own, but it actually just meant that they both hated me for colluding with the enemy. So first, let's talk about Vim. It's going to be a very quick overview of text editors if perhaps you're new to the kernel world or development in general. Vim, you got your modal editing, so you don't have to break your pinky going to Control, Meta, Alt, Shift all the time. There's no Lisp, which is a big thing because I'm perpetually afraid of brackets. Unfortunately, it's quite dated. The code is from before a lot of common syscalls. It supports 40+ different platforms that most of you have never heard of, even the aging folk, and generally quite an abomination in there. Some people like to just press a key and have the text show up. That's kind of crazy to me, but some people don't really like that. And Lisp can actually be useful. You can turn your editor into an aeroplane if you know enough brackets. So there are certainly some benefits to having that insane configurability that you get from an editor like Emacs. Now, the problem with Vim is that it's, as I mentioned before, kind of spaghetti. I'm just going to give you some quotes from a fantastic blog post I read. I'll link it in the slides, which you can find on the LCA kernel miniconf website. So Vim is very synchronous, and that includes all its plugins. And so if you have a plugin that's doing something fancy like a code completion, for example, or a lookup of some sort, you're stuck waiting for it. The code is very spaghetti. I was going to show you some of it, but I don't really have enough time. But you can just trust me that it's quite the sight. I don't know. It's definitely not any coding style I've ever seen. Most of its if-defs and various things are for not just before common syscalls, in which you have to check for, but various things that I've certainly never used or seen before. And a few years ago, I saw a patch in 2017 that got sent to the Vim mailing list to fix something or other, and they got told, oh, don't use those evil anti-declarations because some people don't have C89 compilers in 2017. So, there are some there are some things blocking Vim from entering the modern world, and that's the blog post I mentioned. Now, some nice folks, depending on who you ask, went and rewrote Vim into a thing called NeoVim, which is basically just the same thing. It's completely drop-in compatible, allegedly, so that includes Vim script. It's got a Lua runtime if you wanted to do fancy things with your Vim and not use Vim script. The code's nicer and neater and more modern and whatnot. They have, all these fancy new age things like CI and GitHub and Travis and unit tests and functional tests and like a UI scripting test framework thing. That makes it a lot easier to write plugins and integrations if you want to do fancier things. And I symlink it, which some people think is evil, but yeah. So if you want to learn NeoVim, let me see if this works. It's just like Vim Tutor. You just go tutor, and it's even got this fancy inline sidebar thing so that when you do it right, look at that, we get a tick. How cool is that? That's pretty cool. So onwards to Emax, the land of the brackets. It's configurable. It's got a really cool inbuilt package ecosystem, even straight out the box. So you can do MX package install, an email client, because lots of people actually do that. It's got all sorts of nice things you can do to it, but it's old. It's kind of crufty. Lisp is perpetually horrifying, and it's really gross out of the box. The only person I know that uses stock vanilla Emacs is Andrew, and he has the kind of judgment that leads him to host kernel mini-confs, so we don't trust what Andrew does. So Emacs has actually gotten distributions, much like Linux has distributions. So people thought, what if we make Emacs cool, hip, and pretty for the kids to convert them into the cult of Lisp? Well, some things that people have done with these Emacs distributions is that they made it look more like Vim. You have your modes and whatnot. They also usually have things that aren't Vim if you want it. They have documentation that's well formatted with things like read the doc that's very easy to Google for to fix your problem, not just looking at decades of comments on Emacs wiki. There's a lot more pre-configured integrations with other software, so things are a lot more plug and play. So quickly going over some of these, we have SpaceMax. This is kind of the big ticket one. It's got a Vim and an Emacs mode. It's quite easy to configure. It's got these things called layers that integrate with all these other things that you might want in your editor. Why you would want some of these in your editor, I don't know, but I still see a lot of people open email in Emacs. So pretty much anything you could want inside an Emacs window, it's pretty easy to configure. It's very pretty and modern, and I know at least one subsystem maintainer that uses it, if that's an endorsement. There's also a thing called Doom Emacs, which is just edgier, basically. It's younger. The way you use it is you clone the develop branch into .emacs.d, if that scares you at all. It's faster to start up. It's got a bit less abstraction from vanilla Emacs. It has its own module system that doesn't quite as many things in it as SpaceMax does. And I use it, which is possibly a horrific warning sign. So here's the crazy part, and this is the bit I expected to blow minds. Did you know that most developers actually don't use Vim? And here's the kicker, they don't use Emacs either. So I'm going to ask the audience, over 50% of developers in 2019 said that they use which text editor? Does anyone know? Cat, that's a good one. No Cat. Yes, I heard of VS Code, and you're right. Here we go. We're going to talk about using something with Visual Studio in the name to work on Linux. How horrific is that? That is horrifying. But VS Code is a standalone open source editor. It's from Microsoft. It has some links to Visual Studio, but it's certainly nothing like a full IDE runtime. It's a standalone editor. It's got a built-in extension system and a nice GUI and all that kind of stuff. It has a Vim mode like everything does. You can actually embed NeoVim directly in there somehow if you need an actual Vim because you're a lunatic. It's a lot more approachable for new devs. I think if I was, talking to someone who was just starting working on the kernel, this is probably where I'd lead them. It's got a lot of support and whatnot, all over Stack Overflow. It is Electron-based, which means it works on all these platforms, but it also means it's gross and icky, and you're running another instance of Chromium. Thankfully, we all have 32 gigabyte RAM laptops to run many Chromiums, so this probably won't affect you, but sometimes you notice. It is a keylogger, but what isn't a keylogger these days? You can turn it off. So if you use this, make sure you turn off the keylogger before your employer gets mad at you. So that's text editors. You're writing text into a file. How complex can it be? The things people ask, people say, oh, I use Vim, I use uComplete.me, I use Emacs, and I use company mode, things to let me move around my code. How do these things differ between them? And here's the kicker, they're all the same nowadays. People have realized that there's too many languages, there's too many editors, there's too many tool chains. How do we just bring this all together? What's the quality of the completions? Well, that's the thing, they're all the same. So the problem is we have an n plus n matrix of languages and editors, and we need to figure out how to tame it. Which leads to the language server protocol. This is essentially a protocol that you implement how an editor speaks to it, and then you implement how it does magic for each language, and then they only have to learn that once. So this means that once you've set it up for C and taught it about the kernel, you can use the exact same key bindings, the exact same magic that you use for any Python or Rust or whatever stuff you work on, which is pretty cool. So there are two C language servers, and I'll quickly go over the way that they work. So they essentially just run in the background. They're a daemon, and your editor will reach out to them to ask, okay, the users in Emacs are asking for a completion on struct page. Where is that? Where are the usages of that? And then it feeds it back into the editor, so these tend to run as servers. There's two main ones. The first is CCLS, and the other is ClangD. So CCLS was earlier. I use it because ClangD didn't work for me last time I tried it. But development's kind of slowing on CCLS, so if you want to try this stuff out, you should grab ClangD. It's part of the LLVM project and should be everywhere. So how exactly do you build the kernel? The kernel has this annoying problem. Even most C projects use CMake or something, some kind of common build system. The kernel said, screw that, we're doing our own magic. Here's a kconfig. What the heck is that? So we need to be able to teach these how to build the kernel so that we can do intelligent completions, so it knows what's compiled in, so that when I work on the power architecture, when I jump to page size, I want a definition that's in Arch PowerPC. I don't want it somewhere else. How does it learn stuff like that? How does it learn what we've actually built into this thing? Well, we can generate a file called compilecommands.json, and it tells you for literally every object you build when you make your kernel exactly what flags went to the compiler and what headers are included. So these are pretty easy to generate. You can use a tool called bear. So you go bear make, and it'll generate it just based on intercepting what the compiler does. Or you can run this thing in the kernel tree, scripts, gen compile commands, which will just, I don't know how it does it, but it does it and it works fine. So you can have a look at that if you want. So yeah, it handles cross-compilation. Never had to toil the thing about me compiling from PowerPC on my x86 host. It just handled that automatically. It works with both Clang and GCC. It seemed a little fancier with Clang, could do a little bit more. And you can move around the kernel pretty much the same as you can move around any other project. If you ever used a nice IDE for Java or Python or something, you go, wow, this is cool. This would never happen for C. Well, it actually does. And I'm going to try and do a demo, which, can I zoom this? There we go. So let me just quickly show some stuff. So here we are in just a random file, kernel/module.c. It's a pretty good looking file, I don't know. So I've built a PowerPC kernel on this laptop before. So if I just jump to definition on trace events.h, I can go here, and now I'm in this file, and okay, maybe I want to have a look at, I don't know, this struct, trace sec. So if I look at its usages, I can press that, and now it'll tell me, okay, here's some places around the kernel where that's gotten used before. I have this kind of inline view in my Emacs, and different editors will represent this in different ways. So if I jump to that, I go to the struct. I can again, oops, what have I done? I can go look at different functions that use it. Again, if my screen size wasn't tiny, this would work much better. And now, for example, if I jump to page size, it's taken me to Arch PowerPC, because that's how I built my kernel. It's context aware. It's not just jumping based on tags. It's jumping based on how it actually built the kernel. So you get that next level of intelligence. You kind of go from grep to C tags to this. So pretty cool stuff. And again, everything I just did would work if you used a language server protocol runtime for any other language, any other kind of project. So running out of time, but I can quickly mention, if you use Emacs and you don't use Magit, whatever, Magic, Git, it's really cool, and you should definitely start using it. It'll save you a lot of time. VS Code is really good, Git Magic as well. Apparently Vim has like a Vim port immediate, but that seems kind of terrible. I'm sure you just go out of your editor and type git thing anyway. Compilers, Clang, it compiles the kernel. You should check that out sometime. So debuggers, quick mention of debuggers. I was at Linux Plumbers last year, and we had a debuggers BOF session. It's like, what debuggers do people use? And everyone's like, Crash. And it's like, does anyone actually like using Crash? And everyone's like, no. So there's a few guys writing new debuggers. So if you ever used a debugger and like, yes, this was easy, I bet it'd be easy to automate and script, and I still have the will to live. No one's ever done that before. So some guys wrote a scriptable debugger library, as they call it, called Dragon, and this is still in its infancy. It doesn't do everything yet. But it is pretty cool, so you can just type sudo dragon after you've built it and inspect your live running kernel. I was going to do this for you, but A, I don't have much time, and B, I thought poking at my live kernel on my laptop I'm presenting from probably wasn't the wisest decision I'd ever make. So you can do things like poke around, you can find what your init task is, you can look at all sorts of different functions around the kernel, you can iterate for each task for different blocks, you can find all sorts of stuff, and now you have like a Python interface to do that. So there's all sorts of examples with that. Won't go into too much detail, but if you end up doing a lot of kernel debugging, whether it's live introspection or whether it's looking at crash dumps, this might be a nice way to do that, especially if you'd like to script looking for a specific thing, getting a specific metric out. This is quite easy to build around. It is quite young though. Speaking of young, SDB is like a shell-like front end for Dragon. It's even younger and most things don't work, but for some stuff it does know about, like stacks. It's got fancy stuff to pull stacks out with certain functions or things in them. You can look at different addresses. You can iterate through slabs and pull out things based on their allocated size and different stuff. This is very young and it kind of only knows about things it's been specifically taught, but I'd keep an eye on this because if it gets going, you'll kind of have a bash-like shell where you can pipe different kernel debug things into each other and get a whole bunch of really powerful information out really quickly. So it's worth keeping an eye on as they keep working on it. Quick mentions of other stuff. Ccache. If you've ever built a kernel and went, wow, that took a while, and then spent another 10 minutes waiting for your kernel to build, you might want to look at Ccache. I'm sure plenty of you already use it, but it makes things very drastically faster if you're doing repeated kernel builds. Git series, I personally haven't started using this yet, but it makes it quite a lot easier to track transitions between revisions of series. If you've ever written a cover letter for v4 and go, oh crap, what'd that change from v3 again? This is very good at being able to do that for you. It's one of my New Year's resolutions to start actually using this. Smart spars diff, this is just a random one I chucked in there that my friend wrote. But if you've ever ran spars and went, oh crap, there's a billion warnings, what did I actually introduce? This can give you a good before and after diff of that. I'm sure there's plenty more things, but you should let me know. So testing, this is my plug for my talk on Friday, because I don't have enough time to talk about testing today, but I have a talk Friday morning about testing. It's called The Magical Fantasy Land of Linux Kernel Testing. So if you want to hear about test frameworks and stuff, you should definitely come to that and come heckle me. Yes, there it is. All right, thank you very much.
We do have a few minutes for questions, if anyone's got any.
Or opinions. I'm always down for opinions. Eclipse. Have in fact seen someone use Eclipse for kernel development. Have thrown up a little in my mouth. It's just, there's an editor for everyone, That's what I say. All right, thanks very much.
About what merit actually means. Are these people not showing merit because they're bad, or are they not showing merit because we've set up a systemic structure that stops them from being good, or allowing them to be good? And then we try to fix this by bringing in codes of conduct, and the howls and the howls. Because why should I have to be shackled to this code of conduct? Because I've always been a good person.
It was on your face and it's disgusting.
And that's, that's a problem. And then the other problem that I have is that people
like to resort to the pithy philosophical thing, like the Zen of Python is great, but it requires interpretation, as does the Unix philosophy. And so if anyone comes up to you and tells you that your code of conduct only needs to be excellent to each other, you need to tell them to okay. Because unspoken with this is, who must be excellent to who? If I bait you by calling you slurs or something like that, and you explode at me in a fit of rage that I have quite rightly earned, have you been excellent to me? And at that point, can I run to my governing body and say, oh, they yelled at me, And conduct and community management requires a lot more sensitivity and a lot more nuance than that. And so in both community and technical sense, it's safe to say that complex problems have simple, easy to understand, wrong answers. And that we should understand the past because it's important to know it so you can learn from it, but you can't let it bind the future because that just closes things off. As Sean Brady said in his keynote yesterday, it's important to learn that sometimes you can drop your tools and try and make new ones. And thank you very much.
All right, welcome back again. I work on Kubernetes every day, which probably isn't a surprise to anyone who's talked to me.
It looks as if there are combine barricades up ahead. They're stopping anyone from getting any closer to the vault.
Whatever James is about to say, Kubernetes has terrible defaults.
Now that's the spirit.
And every time we talk about these things, it's good because everyone needs to know about the things you have to not make default in Kubernetes. So, James, tell us about these defaults.
Thank you. So welcome to my talk, Unsafe Defaults, Deploying Kubernetes Safer-ish. I'm James, I'm made of meat, and therefore I make frequent mistakes. Some of those are sometimes working with Kubernetes. I work in InfoSec in Tokyo as a penetration tester, and my company's legal team has not reviewed this because I didn't really feel like explaining what Kubernetes was to them. So I'm not going to declare my company name here, but we are looking for good, passionate people who can either dev or ops or do both or do InfoSec or whatever. So if you weren't at the jobs birds of feather earlier, come talk to me if you maybe want to move to a country that acknowledges climate change or something. Could be fun. But I'm here all week. So quickly, what is this Kubernetes thing anyway? I've been testing a lot of the security of some deployments of this recently, so I thought I'd give a talk on that. So hopefully this is immediately clear to everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. Right, no, but seriously, somewhere about here in the DuckDuckGo results, we find that Kubernetes is the new SaaS, right? It is the new suffering as a service. No, but for about approximately the next 10 minutes, I'm going to do an absolute injustice and super quickly explain what Kubernetes is in case you've never used it before, and how you might go about installing it. And then the next 10 minutes will be just some really quick wins you can make on improving the average security of your cluster. Now, please do understand that this is a little bit like how to build a race car in 10 minutes. You'll be fine. And then here's how you drive that thing. But let's power on. In the middle of Kubernetes, there is an API. This is super important. You probably know that Kubernetes has something to do with containers already. Hopefully that's why you're here today. And these containers are defined by configuration. You're probably already quite familiar with Docker files. This is not dissimilar to that. The Kubernetes API is most commonly interacted with through configuration. You can read config files from disk, or you can stream them dynamically into the API. And one part of Kubernetes is a state machine. The configuration that you apply to Kubernetes can be used to create policies, and Kubernetes will change its own state to meet those policies. For example, one policy might be always have 3 web server containers running. And if Kubernetes checks its state and finds there is not sufficient numbers running, it will create more of them until that desired state is met. So Kubernetes is an orchestrator. All right? It tells the systems what to do before, during, and after running your containers. So it's got this concept of managing the entire life cycle of an application, from its birth to its death and so on. It's pretty complex, right? There's a lot of different moving parts in Kubernetes, and that makes security difficult. And you get to say DevOps a lot, which is either nice or terrible depending on your perspective.
Let's take the long way.
And Kubernetes was originally built designed by Google. You've probably heard things like everything at Google runs in a container, or that every week Google starts 2 billion containers. That's over 3,000 containers per second all week, which is just insane. But Kubernetes is the evolution of their system that they called Borg, which they built to make actually running 2 billion containers a week possible. But from a security perspective, the API, that bit in the middle, is like the good stuff. If you can own that API, you own the entire cluster, and it is super difficult to evict anyone once they've got that level of access. So you need to defend it really, really well. Some quick concepts about Kubernetes architecture. Apologies to anyone that's an absolute expert in this. It's super generalized, but it will help later. In general, you have a master node, which runs your API and a lot of the other core Kubernetes components, and you have at least one worker node that does all of your workloads. You make requests of the API on the master node, and based on configured policies, it issues commands and instructions to the worker nodes. In this case, deploy an app. Kubernetes deploys pods, which are groups of containers that make up a whole application within your microservices architecture. It's a Docker joke, right? Pod of whales, pod of containers, anyway. And this is all defined by your configuration, right? You pipe YAML or JSON off disk or off GitHub if you're feeling game. And one interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize about a pod of containers is that all of the containers in that pod actually share an IP address. And depending on your application's architecture, that can sometimes bring in some interesting security concerns. But Kubernetes can also scale rapidly easily, right? By adjusting your configuration, you can say, oh, now I want 3 of those, the policy changes, the state machine churns, and Kubernetes generates more things. But because Kubernetes is really targeted at orchestrating far more servers than a human can reasonably manage, most clusters will have many, many, many worker nodes. In this case, Kubernetes can evenly distribute your workloads, taking into account the available resources and some other constraints that are not immediately clear to you. But this is also interesting from a security point of view. There's a lot of complex moving parts, and large swaths of this are designed for automation, not direct human intervention or manipulation. It has a very different threat model and a very different surface area for attack compared to your regular old virtualization. As we all know, containers share the kernel of the host and leverage namespaces and C groups to provide that level of isolation between themselves and the host and each other and networks and things. In most cases here, when a container gets compromised, it's like the attacker is calling from inside the house. They already have a shell on your systems. And it does mean that a compromised container is very close to being a compromised host, especially if the configuration's not very strong or the policies there aren't very secure, or if the kernel's out of date and there's a good kernel exploit. Multi-tenancy in particular is one of those things that is very, very difficult to get right in even regular virtualization environments. Keeping one customer away from another, let alone when you've got different customers, different companies, different users all sharing the same kernel. Imagine trying to lock someone out of your own machine that has a user account. How well can you restrict their processes from yours? So to understand what we're up against, I like to look at how Kubernetes is frequently installed. And to be honest, it's mostly garbage. I see a lot of this nonsense on the internet, right? I see piping random URLs from like Russian websites into sudo bash, or the modern equivalent appears to be just curling someone's Ansible playbook, or Terraform scripts, or Chef cookbooks, or whatever automation scheme it is. And sometimes people say, well, in order to get this thing running properly, you kind of need to make a sacrifice. But really, often a lot of it these days you can apt install, but that's not the end of the installation. That's merely getting the software that you require. So here's a great example of how not to build strong defensible infrastructure. or perhaps this one. K3s is like the Raspberry Pi version of Kubernetes that's stripped down and in a single binary. Is anyone actually running Kubernetes at home? Like, do you have a home lab, cluster of Raspberry Pis maybe? Yeah, also spawning 2 billion containers? No? All right. Got to serve those spicy memes somehow. But of course, you need Docker first, right? Or you need a container runtime environment, and Docker is like the go-to for most people. But you got to curl bash this one as well. At least they do tell you that you should read these before checking them, but if you copy and paste that, you're not going to see it. Or you could, follow a nice one-liner on Medium articles because 2 lines is too much. Or you could follow someone's GitHub or Hacker News. Or this one's probably my favorite because it actually says like, hey, this is secure because we're using HTTPS. It's all good. But the great thing about piping things off Bash, right, or into Bash, is that I can do that too. Right? There are plenty of projects out on the internet that will attack a Kubernetes install, give you interesting things out of them. And I'm significantly less interested in the stability and the integrity of your cluster as a penetration tester than perhaps you are as a sysadmin. Yeah, that was controversial. So I've piped all of the things. Can I go planet scale now, right? That's why we're here. Well, no, you can't, because in order to join your worker nodes to your master nodes, there's some pesky SSL errors that are going to get in the way, so you can totally ignore those. This is from the official documentation too. So, moving on, right? As a community, it is overwhelmingly clear that we're letting each other down. We're setting ourselves up for failure, and we really need to get better at doing this. Some of this is the beginnings and the root causes of a lot of the security problems that I've found when testing Kubernetes clusters, because I will talk to the sysadmins and say, hey, how did you set this up? And they're like, oh, we found this great blog. And yeah, it tends to go downhill from there. If you are going to set up Kubernetes properly, there is much more configuration that needs to be done than just piping some shell scripts or following some Terraform article, like scripts or whatever else. If you're going to set up a new one, please follow the official documentation, even if it is really overwhelming. There's a lot of information there, there's a lot of moving parts, but it's up to date, and it does give you a full picture of what you need to know about the surface area of your cluster. And if you're going to audit someone's cluster, like, go and talk to them, ask them, how did you set this up? Do you know what all the moving parts of this are? Because there's a good chance that they're not entirely aware. So, 3 quick things to give you some easy wins on your clusters, because you didn't just come here to be told, well, read the docs, go home, that's fine. But there needs to be some more meat to that. So this really could be an hour-long talk, but we don't have time for that, and we still wouldn't cover everything. So these are your quick wins. So I did mention this API earlier, right? And I said this was the good stuff. It's available on 2 ports by default, right? So it binds to localhost on your master nodes on port 8080, and it's quite interesting because by default, it uses no TLS, it uses no authentication, and it has no checks for authorization. So if someone can pop a shell on your master node, they require no further information to go and talk to your Kubernetes API. So this is one of those reasons where people say like you should never run your cat blog WordPress servers on your master node, like just let it do the master stuff and have a worker node. But frequently, and especially in like small test deployments that have grown and were test but are now a lot closer to production than you feel comfortable with, I see this quite frequently. So the second port it binds to is like the first non-localhost adapter. It uses TLS and authentication and all that good stuff. There's a component inside Kubernetes as well that runs on the master node, and it's called the Kube Controller Manager. It does the core control loop elements and regulates the state, a few other components. And until recently, this would default to talking to the API in Kubernetes on that localhost bound port instead of the network port. So what that meant was as soon as people tried to lock this down on their cluster would entirely break, right? The state machine would stop working, it wouldn't be able to automate any more tasks, and they would quickly revert that change because they didn't understand what went wrong, and once bitten, twice shy, not gonna touch that one again. So there are also clusters that have upgraded. So the new version of the Kube Controller Manager does talk to the public network port because it's still just going to hook back locally anyway. But it's forced to check, the SSL certificate, and it uses authentication. There's a token involved, and that's much better. But the ones that haven't properly upgraded may not have great security around that. On the authentication and authorization, right, there's a process that a request must go through when talking to that API in order to execute a request. There's 3 main stages. There's the authentication, the authorization, and the admission control. The authentication is typically done with certificates, username, passwords, tokens, all the usual
Alex,
suspects.
you need to get out of here
The
now.
authorization comes from policy. So once a user has identified themselves, are they entitled to run that command? This is typically done with RBAC, and the admission control part at the end there is where you can plug in extra modules. So this gives you a final opportunity to validate a request. Can this system do this based on this external third-party thing? So that might be like your external key manager or some third-party vendor security appliance that says, we're going to filter this through some other security matrix. Now, modern clusters will use TLS for all of the communications that happens within here, but by default, out of the box, they're signed by the root CA that's set up on your master node, and that is self-signed. So if you're setting up a whole new cluster, or if you're not using something like Azure AKS, where say Microsoft looks after your master node for you, you really should go back and actually make sure that you set that up to be a valid certificate, right? Or at least something you can identify. So when an attacker goes and starts swapping in and out certificates and adding their own keys to certain CAs and things, you can detect that. You can identify it as opposed to, well, it was a randomly generated cert and it appears to be valid. Yes. But you don't always need to authenticate either. So Kubernetes will tolerate unauthenticated users and bind them to different groups and roles and privileges depending on the version of the cluster and what particular level you've upgraded to. It's worth checking and definitely stripping away privileges from the unauthenticated user role if you want to secure your cluster. You can also just completely outright disable this. There's a command line flag for it. And then that way unauthenticated users have no ability to glean any information from your cluster. The latest version, just for reference, is 1.17, which came out in December. There's still lots of older deployments out there, sitting around like 1.13, 1.14, that their APIs give you a lot of information, and
you're going to have to find the power source for that barrier there.
So if you're responsible for a cluster and you don't think that anyone can just should have the right to just query your cluster for fun facts, here's one you can turn off. There was also a really weird blip in Kubernetes 1.5 where they swapped over, so this was disabled by default, but then 1.6 they turned it back on by default because people got grumpy that things broke. And that's the undertone of a lot of the changes in Kubernetes. But there's also tokens. So instead of using a username and password, because that just is awful, and certificates, which no one likes managing, you can use a token. This is typically done for service accounts, right? Some automated process that needs access, and you don't want to manage giving it a whole user account, you can give it a token. And Kubernetes uses a lot of these internally. In general, they expire every 24 hours, and they're automatically rotated by Kubernetes, which is great, because then you don't have to worry. There used to be a type of forever token, which, as a pen tester, was a goldmine, because if you could extract one of those, it would never expire, and you would never have to get your way back into an environment once you've been evicted, because you still have a valid token. And this was given whenever you created a pod that was run as a service account within Kubernetes. And what was also great was no one ever changed them because they were a complete pain to rotate. Because what you actually had to do was then delete all the pods that used that token, so you had to shut down all your apps, so then you've got an outage. And then you had to delete all the secrets that were stored in the Kubernetes secrets manager that was associated with that token, and it was just a nightmare, so no one ever changed it. Fortunately, that is no longer the case, but if you have an older cluster and you've deployed pods under a service account, they're still there. So you have to go and replace those and change those. And of course, yeah, if they're leaked or stolen, it's an absolute gold mine.
Yeah, that's not good.
But also, everybody gets a token in Kubernetes by default. So every container you create by default in Kubernetes gets a free token to talk to that API and issue requests. Right? Kubernetes will mount like a bind directory into your container with a token. Here's the fancy words that back up that claim. This is obviously off the docs, but that token allows your container to talk back to that API with an authenticated state and make requests within the namespace that container exists in. So this is really useful if your container needs to interact with Kubernetes, right? If it's a load balancer and it says, oh, actually, I want you to create another clone of me because I'm too busy, or some kind of state regulation like that. But if you weren't aware that this is something that happens, there's a good chance you don't need it because you're not even using that level of like interactivity between the apps that you're running and the environment that orchestrates it. And yeah, it gives you quite a bit of privilege, almost certainly more than you're comfortable with. But fortunately, the whole directory is protected with a very strong file system requirements. It's chmod 777, so you can, as any user, even Unix nobody, you can read that file. You can see that it's a JWT, and it's encrypted. Like, well, it's base 64, wonderful. And the default namespace that like it will even tell you the namespace that it's in, which can be quite handy if you see something like a cube system. The default namespace is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin, right? That is where all of your apps go if you don't specify what your namespace is going. So it does end up being quite a dumping zone of like spare containers that people haven't quite configured. I don't have too much time going to namespace because it's pretty much exactly what you expect, right? They provide scope for names, have a unique and something you can apply your scope for resource restrictions too. You get a couple of random Kubernetes, you get your default public. If an attacker can access the cube system one, they pretty much own your entire cluster, so that's all your state management stuff. And yeah, you're going to have a bad time. The other two, you can do by default any value in public default. So don't put all your secret strong stuff in either of those. But here's how you disable those three credentials. It's quite easy, and everyone loves slides of YAML. If you apply this, this will not mount any more tokens into your new containers that you create. You do have to apply this for every namespace, okay? And then you have to restart all of the pods inside that namespace for this to take effect. So, this is one of those things that if you don't have your load balancing set up quite right, it can be an outage and a pain. But this at least takes away free credentials to your API. You're probably thinking by now, like, what can you do with that token? Well, if an attacker can pop a shell in one of those containers and read the file, they can then tell Kubernetes to go and delete all your containers, or spawn all of their wanted Bitcoin mining containers, or tell your bot to go and download a Kali container and then shell back all of their toolkits running in your environment. They have permission to talk to your orchestrator. So this is really neat as well. Kubernetes has a thing called pod security policy. It's a cluster level resource that controls security sensitive aspects of your pod specification. So your configuration, you can say, I won't allow that because my policy says you're not going to do that. This lets you set a bunch of defaults for related fields. So if users don't specify, you get to say this is what it's going to be. And it lets you restrict all sorts of nice Unixy capabilities, right? So you can set your SE Linux constraints, you can set what file permissions you're allowed to use, or their Linux capabilities, are you allowed to bind to sockets, stuff like that. So this is still in beta, it's not enabled by default, and it relies on really good RBAC to actually enforce those controls. So you do have to make sure you've got that set up as well. This is really quite cool, and it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. You do have to keep an eye on your logs, right? So you can see the repeated failures of people trying to enumerate what the hell your policy actually says they can and can't do. But that's worth seeing. And yep, because we all love YAML, here's some. Write it down really quickly because I'm going to move to the next slide. Just kidding. But slides really don't have meaning for this, I'm sorry. But a couple of points worth pointing out. A privileged container is allowed to mount like whack-dev and whack-proc as the host inside the container. So that's a really bad thing for security because it's like privileged escalation galore. Allow privileged escalation to prevent running UID binaries, and the rest kind of just says, well, you're not allowed to run that root UID. But better yet, I'm going to give a shout out to the creators of this, Dustin and Frenchie from Cruise. They've written this tool which essentially gives you a bunch of great defaults. A lot of sane configurations, and this operates in that admission control, that third section of the authorization component in Kubernetes. And it's called KRail. It's a workload policy enforcement tool, right? So they found this quite helpful in a multi-tenancy situation. It's open source, it's on GitHub, but most importantly, it can provide warnings to the users of Kubernetes on policy violations. So as a user, you're typing away on your terminal, I want to apply this configuration to this remote Kubernetes cluster. It can reject your pods or your config based on a reason that is provided back to you. So in this case, this is actually running that exploit that I showed you on GitHub earlier. It's saying, oh, you're not allowed to do this because you can't bind to the host networking. This is quite nice because you can set it in like a warn-only mode where it will still allow it to tell the people, hey, maybe like this is going to break soon, so you can definitely fix that. And it also gives you a lot of metrics and logging across your cluster to help you enforce those requirements and workloads.
It's alarming, actually.
etcd is a component that sits inside Kubernetes. That's your highly available key value store when you've set it up on more than 3 nodes, or it's only on 1 node. It holds the actual and desired state of Kubernetes. It's got a lot of keys and certificates and all that kind of stuff. It's protected on disk, military-grade, uncrackable base64 encryption. And it's particularly sensitive to your latency and your disk I/O. So if your I/O queue lengths get too long, you can start to crash clusters, you can start to stall all their automation. Denial of service attacks are quite easy through that. It's also a network service, which is great. It sits on port 2379, and write access, this is basically root, because you can just shove your own keys up in there, and it will get deployed to all your nodes. And read access is also like the easiest privesc you'll ever have. You can also protect it with authentication. There's a novel idea. You have to go and turn that on manually. That's not something that's set up for you automatically. You can also encrypt the traffic, and you can use TLS to do like peer verification. So by default, if you haven't set that up, there's nothing stopping me adding my own node to your cluster and then like just synchronizing all your secrets. So you can set that up. You can also encrypt it on disk after Kubernetes 1.13, and that does support some pretty good encryption algorithms like AES GCM. It also supports an external key manager, so you can give it to a vendor and make it there. You can also restrict it with a firewall, and it's like the first thing that Kubernetes says, hey, if you're going to do anything to secure your cluster, you should really look at this thing and try and isolate it a bit more. So my advice to you in how not to get your cluster owned in the first 30 seconds is to read the docs instead of just piping random scripts off the internet. You should defend your API like your cluster depends on it, because it does. That's the core of telling everything what it can and can't do. You should remove those service tokens if you don't need them. Now, you can still restrict that to just a namespace or even just specific pods within a namespace. So you can still have things work with the automation they require, but you almost certainly don't need to be giving out credentials for free to everyone. You should probably take a look at that pod security policy thing, because that's really neat. It's effectively your security policies for the entire cluster. And you should encrypt and protect that etcd highly available key store, because that's full of all your secrets, and by default, it's wide open. There's a link at the bottom with some more information. Google's got a lot of really cool docs on how to make this thing kind of secure, because well, they know far more about it than any of we do. If you have questions, come talk to me later. I'll be here all week floating around in the hallway track and some of the other rooms. And there's some other links to some of the resources that I use there. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We have a 10-minute break now.
Welcome back. Up now we have Ivan, and he will be speaking to us about a Kubernetes extension for VS Code. Let's make him feel welcome.
In the beginning was the command line.
all things were made by the command line, and without it was not anything made that was made. And the command line shineth in the engineering department, and the engineering department comprehendeth it not. Good afternoon, my name is Ivan Tolson. I work for Microsoft on the development for a game. We have an open source tool around the container ecosystem. I bring to you the distinction of being, I think, the only Windows laptop at a Linux conference. Tell me if I'm wrong. What I've been working on for a while now is an extension of that brings that Kubernetes experience into sort of tooling experience Why do we do that? Well, we're told all the time, developers love the command. We're really hacking enough with these that we're sitting there up on the screens, rattling out these putting together a bash script so that everything's like command lines are very powerful, very composable. They're something which once you know how to use them, you can become very, very adept, very productive. But here's the statistic I just made up. There are, funnily enough, developers out there who are not aficionados. And we talk about command line as a single monolithic thing. And it isn't. Alyx! You may be very proficient in using, say, kubectl because you've learned so much of that. You may be very proficient with the 4 or 5 kubectl commands you use all the time, and yet every time you use Helm, maybe you have to look things up. I don't know. But there are many developers who are not that confident. They've grown up with GUIs, they're more familiar with GUIs, or they've not got the depth of experience with certain tools that allows them to be productive with command lines in a way that's more experienced can be. Different people have got different experiences. And for some of those people, a GUI gives them benefits such as discoverability. It's easier to find than it is in many command lines. I recall my early experience with Git, which admittedly is an outlier in so many ways. I could not get my head around Git. I could not do it. So I ended up using GUI clients that made Git look like Subversion because I understood Subversion. And for the longest time I used Git that way, until bit by bit, I began to figure out all sorts of other things that it does. I could begin to do that. And actually now I'm kind of half and half between using GUI for some things, the command line for others. I'm mixing and matching. Finding out those features, like discoverability of things like visualization is something that GUIs do well. Kubernetes, for example, the dashboard tries to get the big sources in the cluster. Here we've got PK, which lets you see a graphical tree of how your repository gets together. And the context awareness. If you're in a command line, you're limited to context. For example, what your current working directory is, something like that. But if you're in GUI, project files blow up, and your tooling can look more at, for example, what files you've got open, not just what files are there in the directory, but what are you actually working on at the moment? What's in front of your face right at this very minute?
What is that?
And this is a quote from Brendan Burns, one of the developers, one of the originators of Kubernetes. This is about democratizing the Kubernetes experience, democratizing distributed systems. Kubernetes is a platform for that, but kubectl is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of that experience. So the reality is, you don't live only on the command line. You live in your editor. And so you don't necessarily want to be using Kubernetes only from the command line. It's nice for many of us to have the Kubernetes experience available to us in our editors too. And that comes with one kind of minor but important condition. Don't let me stop you writing this sort of thing for other editors, but this is the only one that I've done. And that's a link to the Visual Studio Code Marketplace. If you're a VS Code user, you can go to that link. It will take you to the extension that I've been working on in the Marketplace. You can install it in VS Code, and it will hook up to your kube config, and you should be good to go. So the extension that we're working on is, firstly, it's fully open source. So let me bring up, that's the GitHub repo. You can see we've got an ever-increasing, depressingly increasing number of issues against us. I've got some pull requests I've not got round to yet. The whole shame of the whole thing is right there to be beheld. The source code is actually even more shameful than the issue queue. It works with any Kubernetes. I am a Microsoft employee. It's under an Azure repo, but there are no, there's nothing that sort of binds it to Azure or to Google Cloud Platform or to any particular implementation of Kubernetes. It's all done under the surface using things like kubectl and the Kubernetes Node JavaScript client library. So it's all using the standard Kubernetes mechanisms. There are no cloud-specific components apart from a few bits that relate to provisioning. So for example, there's a feature in there where you can